And we're, we're going to go ahead and get started to do our best to honor your time. Couple notes of interest. You are on mute as we have a lot of people here. We are going to ask you to, as you have questions for Miguel, just to put them in the chat room, and we'll leave a half hour towards the end to really work with the questions that come into the chat room. So do that as well. And if you don't mind, keep your camera on so we can see your lovely faces. It's always nice to see. So a couple things to say before we turn it over to Miguel. So I'm going to pass it to Brittany.
Thanks, Mike. Brittany, I am lend a hand with Faith and Money Network, and I'm going to share just a couple more announcements of our upcoming events. Just bear with me as I share my screen here. All right, if you are in the DC area and you like what you hear tonight from Miguel, you'll have a chance to go deeper. He will be participating in leading a one-day seminar with us at the Festival Center on October 5th. It'll be a full day of digging into the themes of his book that he will be starting with today. Let me make sure that you can see this in a larger format. My computer's overwhelmed by how many of us are on this call.
It's still blank, Brittany.
Okay. Let me try and reshare that. All right, my computer's not wanting to cooperate. I'll try one more time, bear with me. Okay, I will put these slides up toward the end of the call, but I will just say briefly that we have the faith or the Jesus' promiscuous generosity coming up Saturday, October 5th. You will get information about this via email after this event. It will be a full day exploring these themes. It will be presented in English, but we also will offer live translation into Spanish throughout the day. And that will be followed by a Spanish language chat with Miguel. We also have a lot on our schedule this year in terms of our trips of perspective, which if you're not familiar with our programming at Faith and Money Network, they're not quite mission trip, not quite guided tour, but they're really an experience of encounter. And we have 3 of those this year. The first is headed to Red Shirt Table on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. That will be taking place June 17th through 23rd, and it will be a week of experiencing the sacred sites of the Lakota people and really getting to know more about their culture and the economic development that they've been working on for many, many decades in that area. We also are going to the Deep South, to parts of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi in September 8th through 15th of this year. And that is the second year we're going there in partnership with Hope Credit Union, which is a community development financial institution that's really invested in Black communities, homeowners, and businesses. And folks who are interested in that trip are invited to consider investing in the credit union. And lastly, we'll be going to Central Appalachia in October 17th through 20th, where we travel to Weiss County, Virginia. This has been a trip that we've been carrying on for over a decade now, partnering with the community organizers at Southern Appalachian Mountain Stewards and learning how they are working with young people and folks of color to bring some new community into the area. Again, you will get information on all of these, including deadlines and application forms by the end of the week. And then lastly, Miguel's publisher, Forward Movement, has very generously offered us an exclusive coupon code for his book. So if you haven't yet purchased that book, and would be interested in doing so, members in this event can use FMN25 and get 25% off that book through the end of April. So we will send a code here in the chat as well as by email afterward. Thank you all, and I hopefully will share the graphic versions of that at the end of our call here. But for now, I will ask Mike to give us an introduction to Miguel and his work.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited to introduce you to Miguel. I first want to say one thing you may or may not know or be aware of, that Jesus spoke more about money matters than just about anything except for the kingdom of God. And it's often the last thing we talk about in our churches and faith communities. An earlier presenter of ours 30 plus years ago, Jesuit John Hoy of Georgetown, had a beautiful saying we use a lot. He says, we read the gospel as if we had no money, and we spend our money as if we know nothing of the gospel. After tonight, we will have no excuses. So we're looking forward to, I'll have no excuses, I should say. Miguel Escobar is the Director of Strategy and Operations at the Episcopal Divinity School. He's a writer whose work explores Christianity's complicated and conflicted relationship with money, wealth, and poverty. His first book that Brittany just mentioned, The Unjust Steward, Wealth, Poverty, in the Church Today, is out. Miguel earned a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary in 2007. He served in various roles at the Episcopal Church since then. He was communications assistant to presiding Bishop Catherine Jeffords Shorey, managing program director for the Episcopal Church Foundation, and now director of the strategy and operations at the Episcopal Divinity School in New York City. Miguel grew up in the Texas Hill Country and attended Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, where he studied the Roman Catholic social justice tradition and Latin American liberation theologies and minored in Spanish. He serves on several boards, including the Episcopal Relief and Development and Friends of Forward Movement. Welcome, Miguel. We're so grateful for this book, for your scholarship, and for your willingness to be with us tonight, because Miguel is in Spain and it's 1 a.m. So yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's a real joy, pleasure to be here. I have my cup of coffee right here with me, and also I think the adrenaline of speaking with all of you is going to carry me through. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully this works. Does it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Yeah, just to begin again by saying thank you. Thank you for this invitation for the Faith and Money Network, and then also to all of you for taking a little bit of time out of your busy schedule to reflect and continue to reflect with me on the relationship that the gospel has to the way we think about wealth and poverty and our own relationship to money. Mike mentioned what I do by day. I kind of jokingly refer to myself as an ecclesiastical bureaucrat, which is to say that I spend a lot of time in the guts of the institution and looking at budgets and thinking about how money flows in organizations and through our communities. But by morning, because I'm a morning person, I'm a writer and thinker who explores Christianity's relationship to money and how that intersects with our own relationship to money and that of the church and society's relationship around wealth and poverty. This is the picture of my book, The Unjust Steward, which looks at the first 5 centuries of Christianity's evolving thinking around wealth and poverty, beginning with Jesus's message of reversal, so the reversal of the rich and the poor and dispossession of one's property, and ending with Augustine's much more institutionally focused approach, in which he's, really arguing for the wealthy to give their money to the church and for the upbuilding of the institution of the church. And so it's an exploration very much about the origins of how we talk and think about money. And speaking of origins, I wanted to begin with a little bit of my own origins and share this picture of my family. I'm the little guy on the left with the red bow tie there. And and also you can see my very attractive parents. I don't know. It's kind of shocking. But one of the things that I was really shaped by growing up is their story around wealth and poverty, and specifically poverty. Um, I am the son and grandson of seasonal migrant farm workers, which is to say that my parents, when they were growing up and going to school, they, were taken out of school early at the end of the year and brought back late because they were brought to places like Krakow, Wisconsin, my mother recalls, to, pick in the fields, pick produce in the fields. My dad recalls going to cotton fields outside of Houston, Texas, to do that work. In fact, the cover of my book is based on a memory my father would oftentimes tell us growing up, of being in the fields and having a crop duster fly over and drop pesticide directly on him and his family and everyone who's working in the fields. And I remember thinking about it as a little kid as poisonous snow. And that was a really powerful lesson for me, which I continue to bring into this day, about the way in which our economy, the way we order ourselves, creates people who are considered waste, people who are, called by my colleague. I have a colleague, Cedar Monroe, who's written an amazing book called Trash. The economy creates people that are considered able to be just waste. And when you're from a family like that, that shapes you, and that really, really, really shapes your perspective on, who is flying that plane, who's the owner of this farm, and what do they think about the dignity of the people who are working there. Having said that, I want to make sure that I want to really underscore the fact that I grew up in the midst of abundance. Part of the gospel's message, I believe, is that love is true abundance. And my family was a very, very loving household. And, we were not rich, we were not poor, but we were extremely loving, and therefore kind of grew up in the privilege of that abundance. My dad, went on to work as a construction worker, then a bus driver, then tried to become a fireman. There were no positions, and went on to become a police officer instead, and served for 25 years as a police officer, ending as a homicide detective. And so I grew up in the sort of like, with relative privilege in comparison to them, and yet always hearing these stories of what it was like to be working in the fields. One of the really formative experiences for me, again, of thinking of wealth and poverty, was when my maternal grandfather died of skin cancer, in part because of the skin cancer is very, very prevalent among seasonal farm workers because of the exposure to pesticides that I described. And that was around when I was an adolescent, around 14 years old. And it was really, again, a moment in which I was just thinking about the way in which the world is ordered and the way in which people's dignity is not always seen or respected by our various systems. And if I can point to a moment in which I became a Christian, it was actually that moment as my grandfather was dying, because just whenever I was thinking that, feeling very, very dark and cynical about the world, a priest walked in and gave my grandfather last rites. And that was a moment in which I saw the church as an institution. It was almost unique in caring for the lives of this person who I saw as having great dignity, and yet the world really didn't. And after he died, I began reading the gospel. And it was then that I realized that, wow, the landscape of the gospel, this world of day laborers and shepherds and people working really hard and struggling with hunger, sounds a lot like the world that I grew up hearing and that was being described around my family's table, and recalling in the recollections of their time as migrant farm laborers. With that, I want to share this beautiful quote from the historian Darman McCullough about what makes the gospel so unique. You can read it, but just want to underscore that his argument is that in terms of ancient biographies, the Gospels are extremely rare, if not unique, in the sense of who is centered and who the story is about. It's the story of the poor and the ill-educated and their encounters with God. And generally, the rich and the powerful and the beautiful people are sidelined in this story. And we're going to look again at a really powerful example of that a little bit later today. But kind of immediately what struck me, even as a teenager, I think, was just whose point of view is this story being told from? And that is a large part of why I'm a Christian today and why I've continued to work for the church today. So let me fast forward many, many years, like about 24 years. My interest in religion ended up resulting in me going to study at a Catholic university, Latin American Liberation Theology, going to Union Theological Seminary and working for the church, the Episcopal Church in a variety of roles. And one of the things I noticed in those 24 years of journeying was that the church really talks about wealth and poverty in a way that is different often than the Gospels. I spent 7 years working for the Episcopal Church Foundation, and during that time did many presentations on Christian stewardship. And in preparing those presentations, I was always searching for biblical grounding, biblical examples of Christian stewardship. And there's certainly the passages in Genesis. Then there are a few references to stewards in the New Testament. But I was always struck that the passages in the New Testament, at least to stewards, were overwhelmingly negative. And so it was kind of interesting to think about managers and management and kind of where we got this theology of stewardship from. And it was just an open question for me. And then came March 2020 and the pandemic, and suddenly I had some time in which to begin to really think about that question much more deeply and research that question. And that is when I began the writing of this book. This picture, by the way, is from May 2020, which is one of the first times in which I emerged with my dog. We went to a park and sat. I have the little mask, which actually didn't do anything. I didn't know that at the time, but I was hopeful that it did. But this was really the critical time in which I was thinking so much about and writing this book. And there's a reason for that. As I think all of us know and can recall, the pandemic, COVID-19, was a time in which the difference between the haves and the have-nots really, even more so than it does on a daily basis, just became a matter of life and death. I was experiencing this in New York. I lived in New York City. And there were at the time about 61,000 people in the shelter system. And that meant they were unhoused. They were crowded together in shelters. And that led, of course, to a disproportionate number of people contracting COVID and dying. On the other hand, about 40,000 people from New York's wealthiest zip codes were able to simply leave the city. They left to, they moved to their second homes, or they purchased second homes, or they simply went elsewhere. But again, it was a stark moment in seeing which parts of the city emptied out, which parts didn't, who was considered essential workers, and the consequences of that. The different boroughs experienced mortality very, very differently. If you had employer insurance, you had very different experiences. So just this all to say that part of the fomenting for me was reflecting deeply during this moment of stark inequality, and really seeing how this inequality was leading to life and death differences. Just want to share one video from this moment, this news report, just to kind of continue to kind of remind us of the way in which this health emergency was compounded by an economic emergency, and how that forms kind of some of the background that we have to have in mind when looking at biblical texts. So let me try to switch over here. Oops. Okay, so let's see if this works.
From genteel farms upstate to the struggling city neighborhood 330 miles away, battered by the coronavirus crisis.
They're all poor with no jobs. We don't have enough to survive.
The line for free food stretched more than 5 city blocks in East Elmhurst Friday. The immigrant community has been ravaged by COVID-19. Thousands have tested positive for the virus here and in surrounding neighborhoods, one of the hardest hit sections of the city, compounding the health emergency and economic crisis. Many low-income workers have been thrown out of work and are struggling.
Yeah, I have more than 1 month without a job. Therefore, it has been difficult for me to maintain my family. I only have $20 a week. With that, I can only buy tortillas and maybe even a pack of eggs.
State Senator Jessica Ramos organized the food giveaway with help from farmers upstate, bringing 34,000 pounds of fruits, vegetables, meat, and dairy to her district. She says the turnout shows just how dire the situation is.
Not only are we suffering a medical emergency, now we're really starting to see the effects of the economic crisis, with so many people out of work and with little access to fresh food.
Keith Kimball, who owns La Casa de Leche, a dairy farm in Groveland, a small town east of Buffalo, says his farm normally donates food to nearby pantries, but says once local farmers learned of the need in New York City, they came together to help. Some farms have excess food because of business disruptions. For example, restaurants closed because of the pandemic.
Everybody pitched in and came to the table and found donated goods that we could send down to New York City.
Back in Queens, The donations allow about 700 families here to add fresh items to their diets, while the farmers are donating food that would otherwise go to waste. Ramos helped organize the upstate to downstate food delivery because of her connections to the farming industry.
That we're able to help them move product because they're not able to sell a lot of this product. And while here in the epicenter of the pandemic, we need this food.
Because the need is so great, Ramos is planning on distributing fresh food weekly every Friday, as well as serving hot meals every Saturday. In Queens, Claude McGowan, New York 1.
Okay. So obviously this was a time, I'm sure that story is familiar to many of you who worked on the food lines of your parish and were observing what was happening in your own towns. And, you know, this became repeated across the entire country. And for me, it was this moment of just reflecting, wow, you know, you kind of live with the daily violence of poverty every day, or you at least watch it. But it was just so stark. And the questions that I had were, you know, wow, who gets to leave? Who gets to stay behind? Who's considered essential workers and made to work in the middle of a national health emergency, global health emergency? And then what does the church have to say about all of this? And what has the church said about all of this? Because this is not the first time we've experienced health and economic crisis converging together. And this is a generalization and also a little bit of a joke, but I mean, one kind of historical truism is, at least from my denomination of the Episcopal Church, is when the going gets tough, the Episcopal Church debates the liturgy. And so one thing I was really struck by is that the overwhelming story in the Episcopal Church, at least at the sort of Episcopal headlines, was oftentimes about communion and communion debates. And there wasn't as much engagement around issues of economic justice and of wealth and poverty. That is not at all the story, I think, of what was happening on the ground. There were some amazing initiatives led by the Diocese of Northern Michigan in particular. I see Lydia is here, and want to just honor that, as well as Episcopal Relief and Development did really great work, as well as many, many, many others. And yet some of the surface story, that kind of top level, was oftentimes about trying to think about what this means in terms of liturgy. And I found that to be kind of off the mark at times. And so I, again, just wanted to explore, why is it that we talk and think about wealth and poverty like in the way that we do? And that's, all of this is sort of background for what led me to write this book. Can I just quickly add, I forgot to set my timer. So I'm wondering if Brittany or Heidi could just do a quick time check for me, how far I'm in. Sorry.
You've got about 30 minutes.
Okay, great, perfect. Thank you. Well, so there are several themes then that I want to discuss going forward here. And several themes emerged in the writing of this book. As I mentioned, this book covers 5 centuries, and so it's impossible to go over every single theme here. I picked like 3 big ideas, basically. And one is that in the Gospels, there are many examples of what I've come to think of as promiscuous generosity. This term promiscuous generosity was actually, I read it in a letter by the LGBTQ activist Louis Clay, who talks about Jesus's promiscuous generosity in relationship to his followers. It's a scandalous sort of love and abundance, in that in that it literally makes his disciples and onlookers uncomfortable at times. Right now, I'm working on a new piece of writing, and I'm looking specifically at the widow's mite and the woman with the alabaster jar. And if you're familiar with those two examples of extravagant offering, you can recall that they still make actually biblical commenters kind of uncomfortable in their extravagance and in their excessive generosity. Another place where this comes up is in the Gospel of Luke, in which there is this triptych of parables. We go from the prodigal son to the unjust steward to Lazarus at the gate. And all three of these seem to revolve around questions of what is squandering wealth, what is squandering love, what is excessive. There is this repeated theme. And I think that there is a theme, and it's an instance in which you can see kind of a theme of God's promiscuous generosity with all of us. So I just thought we could walk through the three stories and look at the fact that they have this kind of repeating structure. We don't oftentimes think of the prodigal son as a story about wealth and poverty, but it's very, very pointed in describing this as a rich man and his two sons and a story of inheritance. It explores the story of a wasting of wealth. The son, the kind of main son, squanders his inheritance on prostitutes and partying, and he ends up starving. There is a low point. I mentioned this because that seems to be true of all three stories. There's a low point in which the son must make a dramatic decision to survive. If you recall here, there's a moment in which he's considering eating the food, or he is eating the food of the pigs. And in returning to the father squanders even more wealth on the son by providing a ring and a feast. There is this scene of reconciliation or at-one-ment. And despite the brothers' kind of jealousy and maybe even prudence, there's an affirmation of God's scandalous generosity toward humanity. Then it goes on immediately to the parable of the unjust steward, which is considered by many people, to be one of the most challenging parables to understand. And there's a reason why for this. It appears in this parable that Jesus is sort of praising deception and even stealing potentially. So it's kind of it's a strange parable. Again, this is a parable about wealth and poverty. It's about a rich landowner who's kind of living out of the city, away from his land. His land is managed by a steward. And I would say the other main characters are the workers, who are held in kind of a semi-slavery state through debt bondage. The steward is accused by the owner of squandering his landowner's wealth. Again, this sort of theme of what is waste. And then there's this low point again, and the steward must take a dramatic action to survive. What the steward does is morally questionable. And that's part of the really interesting thing about this parable, is that he ends up using the landowner's wealth to have the debts of those in debt bondage. The image that I've chosen on the left is by a contemporary Russian painter, Andrei Mironov. And you can see in this image kind of the richly robed steward having the debts of the young man in the painting. Biblical commentators note that the debts that are described were so high that really they probably represented the debts of an entire village of people. So we're looking at, the relief and the release, and you can only imagine of what it means for this version of Jubilee, of the releasing of people from such debt. Again, on the kind of the underlying theme here is this idea of scandalous generosity. Not really, you don't really see a picture here of prudent management, which is the basis for so much of our stewardship themes. What we see is just sort of excess and release of debt, even to the point of using deceptive, potentially, modes of doing so, or at least that's what Jesus appears to be suggesting, and what has made Christian commentators and preachers uncomfortable for about 2 millennia. And it concludes with a scene of reconciliation between all three, including the master, which I think is a really strange and interesting detail. Then there is this kind of triptych flows right to a parable of Lazarus at the gate, which differs in some ways, in some very pointed ways. Again, this is very pointedly about wealth and poverty, and again, I think this shows the perspective of the Gospels. There is the very poor man, the beggar at the gate, is named. His name is Lazarus, but we're dealing with a generalized rich man. We don't know his name. And just think about the number of times in stories in which the reverse is true. We oftentimes in the news or in just life, we know the names of the rich man. We know the names of the celebrity. We have no idea about the names of, quote unquote, the poor. The gospel reverses that very pointedly. And so we always just sort of think about that and think about whose names we actually know. I think that there's another theme of wasted wealth here. I recently saw a painting of this parable, and I wish I could remember the artist's moment, but the painting really emphasized just the abundance of food that the rich man had to himself in his home. It was more than he could possibly ever eat. And so there's this, again, squandering of abundance taking place. There's a theme of reversal. Lazarus is received into Abraham's embrace, and the rich man is tormented in Hades. There's a low point, because Hades, it doesn't get much lower than that. And the rich man is in need of mercy. But here's the difference. In this story, there's no forthcoming mercy or reconciliation for this rich man. Excuse me. And it's this kind of warning story that, you, the rich man, but also all of us, have the prophets and teachings to tell us about what it means to be generous and merciful toward the poor. And this is kind of our chance to live that out in our life. Right in the middle of this triptych, at the end of the Unjust Steward, Jesus says that you cannot serve God and wealth. We have to choose. And just want to underscore that this is such stark, this is a very stark vision, oftentimes within the gospel. And I think we in the church, possibly rightly, but we in the church have really worked to, I think, soften some of these messages. And yet it's always good to go back and think about the bracing expectations within the gospel itself. As I mentioned, this is just one little example of a story of instances in which you really see Jesus praising this scandalous generosity, an excessive offering. But there are many other instances, including the widow's mite and the woman with the alabaster jar. I mentioned right now I'm working on a piece of writing around this. I'm actually looking at the last week of Jesus's life and all the many instances in which money is referenced during that last week. And Jesus points to these two women's offerings of their very last bit, their whole life, everything that they had. Those are two, phrases that are used in each parable respectively, or each instance respectively. He uses these as a description of his own upcoming offering, of his offering of himself, in really, really powerful ways. So then the question becomes, how did we get from these stories of reversal, from the story of dispossession of our wealth, from this story of kind of promiscuous generosity, to the kind of wealth stewardship tradition, which so emphasizes prudence and institutional giving, which is fine, but prudence and a very particular form of giving of today. And in my book, I really note that two people in particular, two theologians in particular, really usher in this tradition, and they are Clement of Alexandria and Augustine of Hippo. Clement of Alexandria, I'm only going to look at Clement of Alexandria just for the sake of time. But he's a really important figure in terms of how the church thinks about money. He's the first, he writes what is considered, at least in terms of what we know, to be the first full theological treatise on money, which is called Who is the Rich Man That Shall Be Saved? It's important to know that he is from a very elite background. He tends to be pretty elitist in his remarks, and he is very, very concerned about having a pastoral approach to the wealthy families, to the increasingly wealthy families that are making up Christianity in the 3rd century, if I'm not mistaken. His teaching is grounded very much in Aristotle, much more so than I would say than the Gospels. It's Aristotle from whom he borrows the idea that wealth is a neutral tool, and he writes about this. The New Testament very famously has a rather negative view of wealth and the accumulation of wealth. But for Aristotle and for Clement of Alexandria, he talks about wealth as being like a hammer. With a hammer, you can build things up, or you can also do a great deal of damage and tear things down. It can be wielded in any which way. And we in the church oftentimes talk about money in exactly that way. There's a lot of reason to ask questions about that, which I'll be able to get to in a little bit later. A second major theme of this treatise is that all of these references to wealth and poverty aren't to be taken literally. They're actually refer to spiritual realities in us. So a rich person can be as humble, in humility. A rich person can be as poor as a poor person. So he really detaches Christianity from the kind of material teachings. And instead we see the spiritualization and interiorization of the language around wealth and poverty. His treatment of the eye of the needle is really important because one of the things that he does is he emphasizes in the Gospel of Matthew the phrase, if you wish to be perfect. So in the telling of the story of the rich young ruler, Jesus says, if you wish to be perfect, you should give up your possessions to the poor and therefore follow me. For Clement, that phrase, if you wish to be perfect, becomes kind of like a safety valve for Christianity, in the sense that for him, what it ends up referring to are those who wish to enter into the ascetic life. It's not a demand made of all Christians, this dispossession of poverty. It's exclusively for the people who wish to go into the ascetic life. And then the last thing that we see is him really, really critiquing the idea that someone would be blessed by God simply on the basis of material poverty alone. This is connected to the interiorization of wealth and poverty. For him, it's not enough that a poor person, it's not enough for material poverty to be the reason in which God blesses an individual. The person has to be materially poor and holy. From that, he argues, one can be rich and in one's disattachment from wealth, spiritually poor. And so we see again this kind of splitting of the person, of the interior person, the interior humility from one's material wealth. I'm wondering if I'm realizing this is getting quite heady. Maybe we can circle back to this just to make sure that everyone is kind of following this. But I guess the big theme is that Clement really does really shifts the way in which Christianity thinks about these terms. And I think the spiritualization of these terms is key here. I think the last person I want to speak about here brings us to kind of a reconciliation, I think, between the New Testament, the way the New Testament talks about wealth and poverty, and the way that Clement does. And to my mind, he's a very important figure because he offers us kind of an Anglican middle way in a certain way. And the story here begins with a famine, another natural disaster in Caesarea in 369, in which the figure of Basil of Caesarea enters in. He's a new bishop. He's walking into a period of famine, and there are three sermons, three homilies in which he elaborates his theology of wealth and poverty. In it, he argues that money is indeed a powerful tool. He agrees with Clement of Alexandria that money can be a tool, but he notes it's a very addictive tool. So it's a special kind of tool. It's not like a hammer, in fact. We can do a little mental exercise right now. If you were to walk into your living room and see a pile of hammers, I would bet that you would have a different emotional reaction than if you walked into your living room and saw a pile of cash on your table, right? Let's just be honest about this. We have a very different emotional relationship to this tool that we call money. And that is what the ascetics were picking up on. I think that's what the New Testament was picking up on. But in the church, I think we fail to often to both hold the benefits of money as a tool and the dangers of this substance. And I intentionally use the language of substance here because he literally compares it to a kind of medicine that can be given to a suffering patient. And he accuses the wealthy of withholding this medicine from people who are suffering at this time, and explores why. Why is it that you are withholding this money? And he argues that we have a dynamic, emotional, and even addictive relationship to this tool. Just a side note, I don't think that just individuals have an addictive relationship to this tool. I think institutions have an addictive relationship to this tool. And in fact, I think that we live in a society in which kind of we no longer even see quite how addicted we are to this tool, and we are shaped by that. I know that's sort of like a power, like it can be maybe even a triggering way of describing it. And yet I have found it to be a very provocative and helpful way of thinking about my own relationship to money, and just sort of having to learn how to be careful about using it, and my own sort of exposure around it. He, in addition to kind of redefining how what is money for us, he urges a different version of stewardship, which I think we can use today in how we think about guiding even our institutions. As I mentioned at the beginning of all of this, I'm an institutionalist. I'm in the guts of an institution, and so I'm also searching for definitions of stewardship that can help make sense of the world for me today. In his homilies, he urges the wealthy to stop stewarding wealth by building larger and larger barns, and instead urges the wealthy to use their resources to become stewards of humanity. So to shift from being stewards of wealth to using instead our resources to be stewards of humanity. And he says, "You have been made the minister of a gracious God, steward of your fellow servants. Do not suppose that all these things were provided for your belly. The wealth you handle belongs to others. Think of it accordingly." Seems like a small shift, and yet I think it's actually a really big shift. In my time working for the Episcopal Church, I've sat around board tables twice now, in which institutions have chosen to not divest from fossil fuels on the grounds of stewardship of their returns, their investment returns, right? But what about stewardship of humanity? Aren't we called to a broader use of our resources for the greater good? What about that version of stewardship, and how does that enter into this? So it seems like a small shift in ideas, and yet it actually isn't. It's a much larger and more connected idea. He practiced what he preached. He ultimately donated his family fortune to build a hospital for the indigent sick of Caesarea. It is considered by some to be the first Christian hospital that we know of. And in a letter to this name, Amphilochius, he explicitly describes it as a church of the poorhouse. It's intentionally a medical mission to people who are poor. So he's really a powerful example of urging wealthy people to use their resources differently as medicine, to alleviate suffering, while acknowledging the special relationship, the kind of dynamic and even possibly addictive relationship that all of us have toward money. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I think these are some questions that I don't know if I want to, I don't think we should discuss them, but I thought it would be good just to put them on the screen as some reflection questions. The parable of the unjust steward has been described as one of Jesus' most perplexing parables. I feel like I still have to think about it and reflect on it, and I'm still challenged by it, particularly the ending in which everyone seems to be reconciled, including the master. I'm wondering, I always sort of wonder about that. I'd love for you to just continue to think about that. I want to ask and be challenged, do you think that there's a theme of scandalous or promiscuous generosity in the Gospels? The Episcopal Church uses the term steward and stewardship positively. I would encourage you to look at the history of the doctrine of stewardship and where it comes from. It's very, very interesting. The Episcopal Church, I guess it shouldn't surprise us that in at least in the Episcopal Church, a denomination that is so associated with whiteness and wealth that we would be praising the managers and management in the characters in this story. I mean, that really is much more reflective, I think, of us than I think of the gospel, frankly. And then lastly, what do you think of Basil of Caesarea's argument about money, about what money is, and then that we are called to move from being stewards of wealth to stewards of humanity? So those are just 4 reflection questions for you.
Thank you, Miguel. Thank you very much. So we have some time for some questions, and if you would pop them in the chat room, and Brittany, if you could pull those questions.
So here's a question, Miguel. Does your book cover the history of the doctrine of the stewardship? If not, where would you point folks to learn more about that?
Yeah, I do. I do talk a little bit about that, and particularly Reinhold Niebuhr, writing in the 1930s, I believe, has a very powerful critique of the then emerging doctrine of stewardship, because it's actually quite recent. It really emerged after the time in which mainline churches no longer did pew rentals. Churches were trying to find a different way of funding themselves. And so it comes out of a sort of every member canvas fundraising campaigns out of actually Australia, came to the United States, sort of baptized within the church, and really reflects much more fundraising generally practices. And then we adopted the language of stewardship for that. But I would encourage you all to look, and I'm trying to think of the most recent sources that I've found the history of stewardship in. The Oxford Theological Dictionary has a great entry on the doctrine of stewardship.
Participant asks, they say they recently read Eric Gill's quote, which is, "Jesus came to make the rich poor and the poor holy." What do you make of this?
Jesus came to make the rich poor and the poor holy. I mean, I think that Jesus, someone recently asked me, so do you, have you dispossessed all your wealth? And the answer is no. And this is connected to the question. I think Jesus is so far beyond, and in so many different ways, where I think the vast majority of us are. I happen to write about his positions on wealth and poverty, but I would say the same thing is true about his position on love your enemy. Like that is far, his position on loving your enemy is way beyond where I am and where I have the courage to be. And so I'm always reminded of my colleague Kelly Brown Douglas's statement that Christianity is an aspirational name to apply to ourselves. It's something that we are going to spend our whole lives trying to work toward and be. And so to the question, Jesus came to make the rich poor and the poor holy. I think I agree, especially with the first part. I think that Jesus has a very direct call to people who have wealth to ultimately dispossess themselves of this wealth in service to the poor. It's a very, very challenging call. And we all, I think, live in kind of the bracing, in light of these bracing sort of expectations, and yet also in God's grace. We know that God loves us and that God gives us grace as we don't always live into that. So that's, I know it's complicated and hopefully not an excuse, but I just want to say there's many, many areas in Jesus's ministry that are so challenging, and we are all, I think, trying to live into them at the same time.
Let's see here. Bob White asks how you feel about moving from the term, moving stewardship from the term of giving to generosity.
I personally like it. And here's why. I mentioned this in my book, but not necessarily, I didn't do it here. I gave a presentation on stewardship in Spanish to a lot of folks who had actually were themselves migrant farm workers in a different country. And they pointed out to me that steward, the word for steward in Spanish, mayordomo, has an extremely negative connotation in Spanish, because the steward was the taskmaster, in the same way that we in the United States have a negative connotation with the word overseer, because of our own background around slavery. Steward has that exact same connotation in Spanish, which speaks to, I think, the really negative role that the steward has in parables like the unjust steward, or in the parable of the wedding, the wedding at Cana, in which it's the steward who turns to Jesus and says, like, you shouldn't be, giving the good wine here. You really should be more thoughtful and prudent, and take care of those returns. So I just want to sort of say, I think steward is a really weird term for Christians to fixate on, because of the way in which the Gospels particularly have talked about stewards. So I'm not sure that generosity quite captures it. I like it more than stewardship, but I think more than anything, I find myself searching for a different kind of way of talking about Jesus's message around wealth and poverty. Stewardship feels unsatisfying to me.
Let's see. One participant, Naomi, here says that she was recently challenged to begin thinking about waging a war on wealth instead of a war on poverty as a more Christian view of economic action. How would you respond to that call?
Yeah. I mean, so the first passage of scripture that I really committed to memory, don't test me now, but the first passage that I committed to memory as a teenager was the Magnificat. And that is a passage in which, she is celebrating a God who brings down the rich and lifts up the poor. There is this image of reversal in the Gospels, and it is powerful, and it certainly suggests that some of the most forceful commentary within the New Testament is directed at those who are accumulating wealth. One really important, I think, thing that we need to consider within the New Testament is that accumulations of wealth were always seen, almost always seen, I think always seen, as the accumulation of wealth made through exploitation of others. There wasn't a good version of wealth. One might ask whether there's a good version of wealth today. But certainly from the New Testament perspective, from the perspective of the way in which wealth is handled and described, any accumulation of wealth was always kind of seen as suspect and negative. And just remember, Jesus, who loved the temple, I think he really truly loved the temple, went into the temple and called it a den of robbers, right? I mean, and as having made it into a marketplace. This is an extreme critique of the accumulation of wealth in that place. And, you know, one just has to ask about that today.
You mentioned earlier that the modern issue of addiction to money isn't just a personal issue, but also an institutional one. Could you share an example of that, or talk about like the symptoms of addiction that we should be looking for in the institutions that we're involved with?
Sure. Let me take a really, really kind of step all the way even back, and then go and look even more specifically at institutions. I mean, in capitalism, we are addicted to this idea of continuous growth, that we always have to be growing, no matter how many resources we are wasting, how many worlds and ecologies that we are destroying. And you know, where does that come from? I mean, why are we always having to increase the amount of wealth and exploit until we kind of get our returns further and further and further higher? And I mean, that's the huge picture, but at some point we're going to have that conversation about what is this drive? Where is this coming from? Why can't we ever talk about enough? Do we have enough? I think some of the most powerful, I saw in the chat, someone mentioned limitarianism. You know, some of the most powerful thinking around environmentalism and ecology is just this trying to get people to talk and think about, do we have enough? I think many of ourselves, we actually do have enough. I think that goes all the way down to our institutions and our churches and other types of organizations. I mean, one conversation that I've never seen actually happen on a board meeting is, you know, do we have enough to accomplish our mission? Do we have to be constantly, you know, what's the word? There's a scaling up, right? Do we always have to be scaling up to the next level? Or are we able to accomplish what we need to accomplish at this level best? Is this enough? It almost feels like a betrayal to raise that question. Similarly, in our own individual lives, I mean, you know, I don't want to, well, anyway, I'll just say it. You know, you read stories of people who work for Amazon, for instance, and are making a lot of money, and they're working, you know, really, really many, many hours, and so many hours that they're not even able to go on a vacation with their kids. It's like, at what point do you say that you have enough? At what point do you say, like, actually, I have enough to have time with my family. I have enough to have time with my kids. I have enough time, to, you know, like that. if we're not talking about enough, I feel like so oftentimes we're using money to fill an emotional void in ourselves. And that's why it always connects to spirituality, always connects to our psychology. And I think, again, it happens at the individual level. It also happens at the institutional level. Yeah.
There's a longer comment here in the chat, but the question in it is how much, it's essentially saying the church seems to accept wealth, doesn't do much to critique it, but it focuses on a charity and being good stewards. So how much energy should we or do we put into dismantling these systems of wealth versus focusing on, I believe, using money to good ends?
Right. And I want to say, like, I'm a huge believer in philanthropy and using wealth to good ends. I mean, I really do believe, like, as I said, I serve on the board of Episcopal Relief and Development, and I really believe that they provide an important service to the church in the sense that we can give directly to people who are struggling all around the world, and that is, I believe, a part of our Christian role and mission. And I want to uphold that Christian philanthropy tradition as deeply rooted within the gospel. And I also want to just, affirm, there's this wonderful quote by a bishop from Latin America, and actually probably you all know it even better than I do, but he says something along the lines of, "When I feed the poor, I am considered a saint. When I ask why the poor are hungry, I'm derailed as a communist." Right? Like, it's a great line. Because it shows what we in the church and in society uphold and accept, and what we absolutely do not accept. And I think that the Christian tradition from the New Testament on actually does both. I really do think that there is the description of service and love and feeding the hungry, and also asking, but why? Why is it that people are hungry? Why is it that we create systems in which we're okay with whole categories of people, being waste people, as my colleague Cedar Monroe says, people who we're okay with just exploiting and marginalizing in society. And so I think some of the most powerful work that is done is able to balance both of those traditions, both the service as well as the advocacy and questioning that takes place.
Do you have more to say, Miguel, on how your research and study of first these gospel parables, but then these early church thinkers affected the work that you do by day? Like you say, the nitty gritty of being in church administration. Did that change that lens for you?
Yeah, it really did. I mean, and I just want to, I think particularly the work Basil Caesarea. I didn't mention his own background, but I mean his background is fascinating. He the first part of his life was as an ascetic. As a young man, he traveled around for a year and visited different ascetic communities, returned home, founded an ascetic community with his sister, Macrina, and they authored, I think together, a rule of life, which is still considered the kind of main rule of life in the Eastern Church tradition. But then he became a bishop. And so he brought with him his ascetic training and his ascetic thinking on wealth and poverty into his ministry as an institutional leader. And you really see him sort of wrestling and how that sort of incorporates. And that's where I think he comes from in terms of this understanding of stewardship, a use of one's resources as to be stewards of humanity. And again, this kind of notion of wealth as or money rather, as not just a tool, but medicine, kind of highly addictive medicine even. The other place that I would say this study has shown me is that, again, more as a critique of stewardship, we oftentimes talk about time, talent, and treasure as these kind of three equal types of gifts. But the gospel actually talks about them very differently. So there's generally some suspicion around treasure. There is an emphasis on talent and investing in your talents so that you can kind of show forth and serve the poor. Important note within the Gospel of Matthew, the parable of the talents comes right above the description of God's judgment. So you're investing your talent, and then there comes, so that you will be, did you use your talent to offer a cup of water to the thirsty? Did you clothe the naked? Did you give, serve the prison? These two are connected in ways, and we oftentimes separate the two. And then but the most important one is the gospel's treatment of time. Time is limited in the gospel. There is actually a sense of urgency in the time. We oftentimes talk about scarcity and abundance and trying to think about these things, but actually there's scarcity of time in the gospel. Time is short. Time is running out in the gospel, and that's the way Jesus talks about it. And that has really shaped my understanding of kind of the urgency of now, the urgency of trying to also just enjoy life and being with a family. I didn't mention this, but I'm actually in Spain. I did mention this. I'm joining from Spain. That was a personal decision, grounded in part out of stewardship of time, talent, and treasure. My partner and I, after COVID, he worked in school system throughout the experience. We just decided, okay, we're going to take a break. We have enough. And we're going to take a break, and we're going to go and just kind of enjoy being together, kind of bring down the stress so that we can go back to our life of our work. It was a kind of crazy decision, but one that was focused deeply on this kind of, how do we use time? We have limited time, and we need to think about it very, very carefully.
This is a question that may be challenging to answer, but it was noting that when you're thinking about the scarcity of time and you're working for an institution that demands more because they don't have enough under capitalism, even though you do, how do you deal with that? Or what's a way to frame that?
Yeah, it's very, very hard. And well, I think every institution kind of squeezes the orange dry, but the church is kind of famous for squeezing the orange dry, and really not really honoring that. Yeah. How do you set boundaries around that? I think that is a really challenging question. I'm not sure I know, nor do I think that I've actually really answered that well for myself. I think, the sort of immediate is trying to think about how you respond and set boundaries within those institutions. For myself, I have to think oftentimes about why it seems I have such a hard time setting those boundaries. why it seems I'm so willing to kind of give so much, and what that's rooted in. I mean, I like, do I have a feeling of abundance? Do I have a sense of something that I'm trying to fill with work? And I think we have to just sort of try to be aware within ourselves about where some of our own, maybe even complicity around some of this is coming from. But I think the original question was more about institutions doing that. And honestly, I don't think I have an easy answer for that question. If others do, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because that would be really helpful for me too.
I think Brittany had to step away, but I see another question here. So in some of our faith communities, we're very nervous about talking about money. And it sounds like you're saying that Jesus talked about money and wealth and poverty quite a bit. And so maybe we should get over our reluctance or nervousness about talking about money. Are we getting that right? And yeah, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, I think that one of the things that I've been struck by over the past, I guess, 2 years of doing these sort of talks is how much pastoral need there is around people's relationship around money. You know, whether or not the church talks about it, people have a vexed relationship to money in their spiritual lives. It's something that people think about it probably every single day, if not multiple times a day. And whether or not someone is rich or poor, they have a complicated relationship to it. One of the things I've noticed is that once you start talking about it, the conversation goes deep pretty quickly. People immediately think about how money was handled in their families. People oftentimes, you know, have, you know, maybe even some trauma around the way in which they grew up and saw wealth and or money being handled. And so it's more about the church meeting people where they are, because it's not as if people don't have a relationship to money. They do. And so all you're doing really in talking about it is surfacing some of the relationship of that complicated relationship. I will say that I think we all have to do this gently and thoughtfully. The gospel is certainly like far more out there than maybe the first message that you get across. But I think that it's really, really important to begin to talk to people about their relationship to money and help surface it. And also just, I think we have, in terms of Christianity, I think we have a real gift here. You know, I began this by talking about how I think the gospel is about love and says that love is real abundance. I think the gospel has it right at the end of the day. I mean, its description of wealth as the abundance of love, I should say, is liberating, and it's healing, and it's more powerful than society's focus on material wealth. And so this is about sort of sharing the good news of what the gospel has to say about just about real abundance as being love, love in family, love in community, love that's connected with people and God.
Thank you, Miguel. That's a great place to leave it in the essence of respecting the urgency of everyone's time. I'll turn it back over to you, Mike, for any closing words.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Miguel. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. And we do want to just remind you that we will have this recording for you in the next week or a few days. And just a reminder that We on our website as well, faithandmoneynetwork.org, we have ways to enter the conversation through a money autobiography, your own relationship to money, a generosity assessment. We have some life-changing trips for you to look at if you're it's a little easier if you're in the US, but we welcome that as well. And just thank you for taking an hour and a half of your time to be here with us. And if you are in the area, we'd love to have you join us October 5th for a day with Miguel. And don't forget to take advantage of that coupon if you haven't purchased the book yet. So again, thank you, Miguel. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Faith and Money Network team and Miguel, if you all could stay on for a little bit. We've got some housekeeping things to do. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Have a great night. You'll be hearing from us soon. Can look for an email within a couple of days with a recording of tonight's webinar.